and welcome to Trendlines, a podcast on global affairs brought to you by World Politics Review. I'm Elliot Waldman. Just a quick note before we get started that if you like what you hear on Trendlines, you can stay up to date with new episodes by hitting the subscribe button wherever you get your podcasts if you haven't done so already. You can also find a full archive of previous episodes at worldpoliticsreview.com/podcast. Since he took office last month, President Joe Biden has moved quickly to implement a sweeping overhaul of Donald Trump's immigration policies. Among other measures, the new administration has moved to rebuild the U.S. refugee resettlement program, which had been gutted under Trump. It has ended the so-called safe third country agreements that aim to force asylum seekers to first register their claims in other countries before traveling to the United States. It has stopped construction of the wall along parts of the U.S. border with Mexico, and it has issued a 100-day pause on deportations, although that order has been stayed by a federal judge. Other aspects of Trump's legacy on immigration, though, will be harder to dismantle. Adam Isacson is Director for Defense Oversight at the Washington Office on Latin America, where he and his colleagues have been tracking the impacts of Trump's immigration policies and laying out recommendations for how Biden can repair the damage. He's also a longtime contributor to WPR, and he hosts WOLA's own podcast, Latin America Today, which I would highly recommend to anyone with an interest in the region. You can check it out at wola.org/podcast. I'm really glad he could join us for this conversation today. Adam, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Elliot. I'm glad to be here.
There's a whole lot to talk about here, given that Trump's approach to immigration had so many cascading effects for Latin America. Everything from the political landscapes in individual countries to human rights issues, governance, and anti-corruption. The list goes on, and that doesn't even touch on the impacts on migrants themselves, people who are trying to come to the United States to seek a better life, and for people living in the United States who were bearing the brunt of this extremely aggressive enforcement mechanism that Trump put in place. I know you've been looking into all of this quite extensively over the past few months. I'm curious where you see the damage that will be the most far-reaching and the most difficult for the new administration to address.
Well, I think the damage that needs to be undone is mostly to our immigration system, particularly our immigration system for people who are trying to get protection, people who fear for their lives in their home countries. The idea of asylum, which really came out of World War II and then was enshrined in the 1980 Refugee Act by the United States, got systematically gutted. I mean, the Trump administration was not so efficient at a lot of things, even building the wall, although they really only built wall in about 250 miles of places that you couldn't have walked across before. But in dismantling the right to seek asylum or otherwise to legally migrate to the United States, Stephen Miller was a single-minded, like an idiot savant who could do one thing really well, and that was manipulate the administrative levers, change rules, and make what were often little-noticed changes, and really ended up building this entire matrix of blocking foreign people from legally entering the United States. The New York just has a piece out this first week of February that cites the work of a Harvard professor who set out his students to just sort of document all the changes made in little ways, usually almost never with the passing a law, just on their own, to the larger immigration system. They came up with about 1,060 little changes that were made over these 4 years. So now the Biden administration has to untangle this web. And meanwhile, you've got, as we'll talk about, tens of thousands of desperate people trying to get in the United States to get protection, many of them stuck on the Mexican side of the border. So there's some urgency, even as this entire matrix is just, sitting on top of everything.
That urgency, I think, is being felt most acutely for the families who have been separated at the border, the asylum seekers turned back without even being given a hearing, the community leaders here in the U.S. who have been unjustly deported. What recourse is there now, if any, for the people who've been affected by Trump's immigration policies to try and seek accountability and recompense?
Well, we're going to have to start with what is in the Biden administration's executive orders. I mean, and maybe we should just quickly go over what some of those would do, although they often are worded sort of tentatively. The first, obviously, is to put a 60-day pause on border wall building while they figure out how to get out of contracts and redirect money. On February 2nd, a whole bunch of orders came through, and with a whole to-do list of things. One is to set up a task force to reunify families, at least the more than 600 families that remain separated from the family separation policy that hit its peak in 2017 and 2018. There is going to be a strategy for heavy investments into Central America, particularly its Northern Triangle countries, Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, to address root causes of migration, which will probably be more of a long-term approach, obviously. There will be studying ways to get rid of one of the main ways since March of last year that the Trump administration stopped any asylum-seeking migration, which was the pandemic order saying that because of health reasons, nobody even gets a chance to ask for asylum and we're going to expel them immediately. That's called Title 42 because of the part of the law that orders it, and it's expelled very quickly more than 400,000 people since it was put in. Then, of course, there is the Remain in Mexico program, which sent 70,000 asylum seekers back who are non-Mexican back over the border into Mexican border towns to await their court date in the United States while not in the United States, basically dumping families without homes, without support networks, without income sources into places like Ciudad Juarez and Tijuana and Matamoros and other often quite dangerous cities where at least 1,000 have been documented to have been since assaulted, kidnapped, in some cases raped, in many cases robbed, while waiting for court dates that just haven't been coming because of COVID. At this point, at least 28 or 29,000 people are still there in these towns awaiting for their court dates. And many of those who got their cases shut down really didn't do so with anything resembling due process. So dismantling Remain in Mexico is an urgent need. Another thing that the Biden administration has pretty quickly undone, because it was easy to do, is that the Trump administration signed agreements with Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, which are dangerous countries that are sending a lot of people seeking protection, signed agreements saying, we can send, you will take anybody we send from other countries to go seek asylum in your system. These were ironically called Safe Third Country Agreements. And as of February 5th, Secretary of State Blinken said we are backing out of those agreements, which is excellent news. So that's part of the web. I mean, there's a whole bunch of rules that Stephen Miller and others put in during the 4 years, regulations but they put in during the 4 years that are slowly being dismantled. But yeah, as you can see, there's a long to-do list, and the executive orders right now are more a list of intentions than actual, shutting down of these programs. It's going to be gradual.
A lot of the measures you just touched on, including the Remain in Mexico program, the deportation flights, things like that, have also become vectors for COVID-19, have created a lot of hotspots for the spread of the disease, right?
Deportations, especially during the first several months of the pandemic, were happening at a time when ICE's detention centers were seeing a huge spread of COVID for lack of precautions taken in those mostly privately run detention centers. And then the flights were happening with no screening of who was being deported. There was a time, roughly May of last year, when in Guatemala, as many as 15 to 20% of people who had COVID in Guatemala, who had tested positive, had gotten it while in ICE detention and had been deported. So that was a key vector for Guatemala. Similar cases were found in Haiti, in Colombia, of people who were positive for COVID being deported without any notification of their status to the host country in countries that often had very, very weak health systems to begin with. It was incredibly irresponsible, but for the Trump administration, the overwhelming priority was get these non-citizens out of the country.
What were the impacts that are perhaps less visible, the sort of missed opportunities over the past 4 years as a result of the Trump administration's single-minded focus on deterring migrants from coming to the United States?
Probably the one of the biggest losses was we need to figure out how to handle migration and set up the infrastructure necessary, how to handle protection-seeking migration at a time when Latin America, if not the world, but certainly Latin America, is at a time of heightened human mobility between gang violence and climate change and the crisis in Venezuela, and continuing misgovernance in Cuba and in Haiti, and now with natural disasters and COVID, nobody really wants to leave where they live, but large numbers of people are having to do it. And it's not just the United States that had seen a large amount of family and child migration start increasing in the early 2010s. Mexico has seen an astronomical rise in would-be asylum seekers. Costa Rica, Colombia itself is now a huge receiving country. It's region wide, and what we lost during the 4 years of the Trump administration was the ability to set up what we need in order to realistically deal with this challenge. I mean, ideally, let me just get into this for a minute. Ideally, what should happen if somebody from Central America, who obviously doesn't want to leave their home, everything they know, but they feel they have to leave, what should happen? I mean, first of all, foreign assistance should be aimed at making Central America a place people don't feel that they have to leave. And a lot of that means helping Central America fight corruption, which underlies so much of the violence and so much of the economic want in that region. But if they do have to leave, that usually means going overland through Mexico. That right now is terrifying and depends heavily on a smuggler whom you have to pay several $1,000s. That is unnecessary also. Mexico, first of all, should get assistance in helping to break up smuggling rings and the corrupt officials that foster them. But also, in an ideal world, somebody who really needs protection and wants to come to the United States to seek it should be able to cross Mexico with a special status on a bus and just make it to a U.S. port of entry. There's 45 official land border crossings called ports of entry. If you need to get to the United States to ask for protection, your kids, if you are a kid, you shouldn't need to climb the fence or wade across the Rio Grande. You should be able to come to one of these 45 official border crossings, tell the officer, the CBP officer, I'm afraid to go back to my country. I need protection. Once that happens, you should be able to be processed very quickly by somebody with a background in trauma and who and dealing with trauma victims, and who can very quickly look over your criminal record, look over any communicable diseases you might have, do a quick evaluation of the veracity of your asylum claim, which is what an asylum officer would do. And you should be pretty quickly put into an alternatives to detention program. There's no need to lock you up while you wait for the date that you've been assigned for your hearing date. You should have a case officer, maybe at times a GPS device, but you don't need to be locked up. If you have a family or other support network, which almost all asylum seekers from Central America do, you should be able to stay with them, socially distance with them under current circumstances. Alternatives to detention are way cheaper than detention. And that wait should not be 3 or 4 years for your hearing and asylum decisions, as it is now because of a ridiculous backlog in our system. We do need more judges. We need more care about what is a case meriting a really long process. And that decision should come very quickly as due process allows. And if you don't qualify for asylum under even a more expansive definition of the law, then you probably do get sent back to your country. I'm sorry, those are the rules. But if you do, you should be able to come to the United States and avoid being killed. That is the vision. But what we have now is, instead of even getting to really none of those 5 things I just mentioned, Central America, Mexico, ports of entry, alternatives to detention, and backlogs, the Trump administration did nothing to fix any of those 5 things. And now what we have is a mess at a time when, as I said, human mobility is just huge right now.
You touched already on some of the early things that the Biden administration has done to start to try to address some of these problems. What are some other further moves you would like to see, especially to address those immediate causes of the backlog and the grievous harm to people who are trying to come here that you would like to see?
The biggest one right now, and in the very short term, is the 28 or 29,000 migrants who have been waiting, in some cases for a year and a half now, in Mexican border cities for their court dates, often in camps or packed into squalid shelters. they should be let in right now. They are already processed. That whole stage I was talking about where you come to the port of entry and get, they look at your background, et cetera, that's been done already for these people. They have a court date. They should be brought into the United States and allowed to go to the metropolitan area where their family is and await their court date. So that's pretty urgent. On a slower basis, because it will take time to build up the processing infrastructure. Under COVID, it is time to undo the Title 42 restrictions for people who are seeking protection, for people who are directly threatened by gangs or for their political beliefs or because they're LGBT or because they're being pursued by somebody. They should be let in regardless of the fact that we are in a pandemic. We just need to have the right health protections, and groups like Physicians for Human Rights and HIAS and others have put out some pretty detailed recommendations for what those health protections would look like. So, we can do this, and we can do it in a question of a few months. And it seems like, right now the Biden administration doesn't even really have most of its political appointees in place yet to really run this. But it seems like that's the direction the Biden administration is headed. Of course, they're probably never going to go as fast as advocacy groups would want them to. But that does seem to be the goal as of now, speaking in the third week of the Biden administration.
In addition to the tens of thousands of people who are living along the border in Mexico waiting for their claims to be processed, we're already seeing a new surge of migrants trying to cross the border. And we've also seen in the past how this can become a very sensitive, very touchy political and public relations issue for U.S. presidents. Biden himself saw this under his former boss, Obama, in a number of circumstances. To what extent do you see political considerations weighing on the Biden administration's push to do the right thing, so to speak?
Political considerations are very strong. Look, the Biden administration wants to do a lot of things that have nothing to do with immigration. They want to address COVID. They want to get this COVID relief package passed. They probably have some part of their agenda is healthcare and climate change. They don't want their agenda hijacked for weeks while Fox News shows nothing but video of, large groups of non-white migrants coming to, massing at the border in some way or being in detention centers. They don't want that distraction. A lot of political people in the Biden administration are probably saying behind closed doors, look, let's just keep these Trump restrictions in place as long as possible while we build up the infrastructure. And let's keep this problem minimal because, right now with two hurricanes in the space of 2 weeks in Honduras and Guatemala, with the gang problem worse, with COVID increasing unemployment. We're seeing an increase in migration through Mexico to the United States border of kids and families, mostly once again, as we saw in 2014, in 2016, in 2019. It's coming again. Some of it probably encouraged by migrant smugglers who make their sales pitch saying, the big mean hardliner is out of office now. Now's the time to come, whether that's true or not. So, I think the Biden administration wants to do the most they can to not have to process that population until they're ready and have the infrastructure in place. I do think that if they do have processing centers put up, with good capacity, and they do have a credible alternative to detention program in place that's quietly just getting people to where they need to go to await their court dates. That'll take a few months. You might even have large tent facilities, which are ugly and look very, sort of military, but I don't know how else you do this in the short term for this processing. But if you do that and you do it efficiently, you can get these people into the asylum system with very few visuals and very little drama. Fox News will complain. You'll be reading stuff on Breitbart every day about how many kids arrived every day. But if you can channel it to the ports of entry, so you don't have Border Patrol picking up 100 people at a time on the banks of the Rio Grande, but you make clear that, we can take you at the ports. We'll just bus you to the processing center, and you'll never be on camera again. It is possible to do this with very little drama. But yeah, it will take several months to get that set up. And in those few months, this is sort of the dangerous time right now. If people are massing at the border, and if Mexico starts saying, no, we're not going to take back Central Americans who you expel, you got to keep them. And that we're seeing some indications of that happening at a couple of border crossings. Then that makes this period very touchy because there's nothing in place to handle these people right now.
There was this dynamic that developed during the Trump administration of Trump dealing with leaders from, especially the 3 Central American countries you mentioned, where the majority of migrants come from, saying, look, do what you have to do to keep a lid on the flow of migrants coming to the United States. And, that's the only thing we care about. And if you do that, we'll work with you on anything else. And we'll sort of turn a blind eye to a variety of different problems in the region. Talk a little bit about the expectations that has created from leaders in the region who have kind of grown accustomed to being able to flout norms on democratic rights and rule of law and anti-corruption and things of that sort.
This is such an incredible issue. I mean, for years, the image was, the United States always bullying and wagging its finger and using the big stick and telling all of these small countries' leaders what to do. And Trump brought that to caricature. I mean, he was threatening them with everything from tariffs to aid freezes to, calling them every name in the book when he perceived that they were not doing enough to keep their own, these 3 Central American countries in particular, from keeping their own citizens from leaving. And it looked like that classic caricature of the big bully from the north. It turned out that the leaders of these 3 countries, as well as Mexico to some extent, loved it because all they had to do was placate him on the migration issue, which is the one thing that really mattered to Trump and Miller, breaking up a few caravans mostly and agreeing to these safe third country agreements, which were hardly implemented anyway. And in exchange, U.S. pressure on almost every other issue went away. It was a completely transactional deal. So presidents like Jimmy Morales and later Alejandro Giammattei in Guatemala, Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, and Juan Orlando Hernandez in Honduras, who none of whom have clean records on corruption and whose inner circles are believed to be often part of just, if not tied to narco trafficking, then at least tied to major graft. All pressure from the United States on corruption went away. Support for prosecutors who were trying to do the right thing and clean things up, who had made big gains, particularly in Guatemala and in Honduras during the Obama years. Those prosecutors had their legs cut out from under them. There was a UN-affiliated prosecutorial mission in Guatemala called the CICIG that put more than 500 people in jail for corruption or organized crime ties. Jimmy Morales told the CICIG it had to leave. If the Obama administration, if even the George Bush administration were in power, they would have accepted that. But Trump was fine with it. And that worked wonderfully to the advantage of corrupt elites in those countries. And when you really follow back the reasons why so many people are leaving these countries, you do come back to corruption, hollowing out institutions and undermining economic growth and allowing gangs to grow enormously in power. So cutting out the anti-corruption effort actually worsened the root causes of migration in these countries. But it worked well for those particular leaders.
Bukele, it felt to me, really understood especially the dynamic that you had to cultivate with Trump to be the most obsequious possible, to just placate him to the max and say nice things about him, ingratiate yourself with him, and then you would essentially have free reign to do whatever you want, basically, which is how he's behaved in El Salvador.
Yeah, I mean, Nayib Bukele, who's been president of El Salvador for about 2 years and is very popular, is probably the most Trumpy of the Central American presidents. He really made his career using social media, attacking his opponents on social media, attacking the regular media and traditional parties, and sort of going it alone and really giving the impression that only I can solve things, and doing very rash things, like sending the military into the halls of Congress to make a point, things that you could imagine Donald Trump and the MAGA crew doing in the United States. And yeah, I mean, Bukele also just was very skilled at flattering Donald Trump. And keeping off U.S. pressure. That said, I mean, El Salvador is a distant third of the three Northern Triangle countries and who sends the most migrants. But still, he managed, to, you can see Bukele having his picture taken with a lot of top Trump administration officials over the past couple of years. And I think that is changed very abruptly with Biden. The Associated Press is just reporting on February 8th that a weekend earlier, Bukele had paid a quiet, unannounced visit to Washington, hoping to meet with Biden administration officials because he's worried about the relationship, and nobody would receive him here in Washington. So that's a huge change.
Bukele also strikes me as an interesting figure because you see directly the long-term impacts of entrenched corruption and what happens when this problem gets ignored, because a lot of what led to his rise was widespread discontent with huge corruption scandals by the two mainstream parties in El Salvador, and that led to fertile soil for someone like him to emerge.
Right, and Bukele was perceived, and he actually still may be less corrupt than what came before. He doesn't. There are scandals starting to brew, but nothing as big is stuck to him yet. Maybe we'll find where the Swiss bank accounts are later. But right now, he is one of the keys to his popularity, in addition to his charisma and his skilled use of social media, is that he is perceived as less corrupt. But so was Hugo Chavez. That when he was a colonel who led an abortive military coup in 1992, and finally got elected in 1998. Yeah, he was seen as the antidote to a two-party system that was just completely hobbled by corruption. And of course, Chavismo became gradually more and more corrupt over the course of its next 20 years. But that perception that a populist authoritarian leader is not corrupt is often one of the main things that brings them. I mean, even this isn't new. I mean, Augusto Pinochet in Chile remained quite popular even after stepping down from power because he was viewed as not corrupt. And one of the main things that killed his image once and for all in Chile was the Riggs bank scandal, when it turned out that he was skimming from corruption and had some bank accounts in the United States. And that ultimately brought down his popularity. But, that perception of not being corrupt is huge. But then you get these leaders who ride that perception and the popularity it brings to such an extent that they weaken all of the institutions that are supposed to be overseeing corruption, and that then lets them or their associates just take full advantage and start stealing.
We had your colleague, Adriana Beltran, on the show not long ago to talk specifically about CICIG in Guatemala and sort of the backlash to anti-corruption efforts after the progress that was made that you mentioned earlier. And it seems like one of the reasons for that is that when foreign countries or organizations, even like the Organization of American States or the U.S., start to get more involved in this issue, it breeds a kind of opposition to it based on the fact that it's like foreign interests coming into these countries. Given that sort of sensitivity, what kinds of opportunities are there for the United States to support anti-corruption efforts more robustly in the region?
Well, any perception that the United States is trying to, be the big imperial bully is always a narrative that a corrupt elite can use to try to mobilize popular opinion against it. We found, I guess there's two things here. One is the CICIG experience showed us that the United States does still matter. That when the United States withdraws support from an anti-corruption effort, it turned out it is the main counterweight when the rest of civil society or the democratic parts of the government are still too weak compared to an elite that's really been, running roughshod and enjoying major amounts of money for generations. The United States is still the main counterweight. But the other lesson there is that it works even better when it's multilateral. The CICIG was not a U.S. imposed body. It was it had the imprimatur of the UN, the European Union. There were, prime ministers and presidents from all over the world were holding it up as a model. But yeah, once the Trump administration backed down from any defense of the CC once Marco Rubio in the Senate started criticizing it. It wasn't long. I mean, its days were really numbered. It does show that the United States support for the reformers in a place like the Northern Triangle of Central America, where the corrupt have run things for so long. The reformers do need outside backing, and there's no better outside backing than the country that supported a lot of these corrupt elites throughout the Cold War and before. Showing that there's some sort of sea change is crucial, and hopefully we're going to get back to that now in the Biden administration.
Do you see promising signs of that kind of approach from the new team that's taking their offices slowly in D.C.?
We definitely see promising signs so far. There's, I guess we've seen two in Central America already. In the very end of January, in Guatemala's Congress, the corrupt elements of Guatemala's Congress tried to install a guy who's under investigation for severe corruption and is widely seen as corrupt as its newest Supreme Court justice, which would tip the balance on the judiciary and really do away with one of the main checks on the power of the corrupt that's left in Guatemala. The Biden administration officials, like the ambassador, like Juan Gonzalez, who's in charge of Latin America at the National Security Council, were very vocal in saying what a bad move this is. This has not been resolved yet, but I think the Guatemalan government was shocked to see the United States suddenly changing its tune on this naked effort to install a corrupt person. And then I just mentioned Nayib Bukele tries to come to Washington to paper things over and can't get a meeting with the State Department or elsewhere. It usually makes sense to call ahead before you do this sort of thing. But the Biden administration let it be known through leaks that Bukele did this, made this secret trip and couldn't get a meeting. Appears that not Bukele, were the source of this. So that sends another key message. And also, the executive order on February 2nd that sets out in a couple of paragraphs this new strategy for addressing the root causes of migration in Central America has a bunch of bullet points, and anti-corruption is the first bullet point. Combating corruption is right there above human rights, followed by violent crime, followed by combating violence, and followed by economic issues. So it's pretty clear this is leading their list of priorities. And gosh, I hope that really translates into policy.
Adam, thanks so much for making the time for this conversation. It was great.
Elliot, thank you for inviting me. I enjoyed it.
Adam Isacson is the Director for Defense Oversight at the Washington Office on Latin America. If you'd like to comment on the discussion, ask a question, or even suggest a topic for a future episode, drop us a line at podcast@worldpoliticsreview.com. This episode of Trendlines was produced by me, Elliot Waldman, and edited by Peter Dury. You can follow the team on Twitter if you'd like. WPR's handle is @WPReview. I'm @Elliot Waldman with 2 L's and 1 T, and Peter is @PeterDoerrie. Thanks for listening, and tune in again next week.